Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At this time, I would like all in council chambers to please silence or put on vibrate your phone. If you need to take a call, please take it out of council chambers so as not to disrupt the proceedings. Stratford Board of Zoning Appeals will now come to order. Here are the petitions advertised for this session. For those of you not familiar with the process, it's a two-part process. First is the public hearing, where we will hear the items on the agenda, and those who are speaking in representing those petitions will have an opportunity to state their hardship, explain the petition. Upon that, the board will ask questions. Once they are satisfied with the questions, I will ask anyone in attendance whether they wish to speak in opposition or in support of the petition. Once that is set, the public hearing will be closed. Those in attendance are certainly welcome to stay for the administrative session, but as when the board members will speak among ourselves to discuss those petitions. You can stay, but it's a closed session, so you will be silent partners in observance so that we can ascertain whether to accept or oppose the application. With that, please, no clapping, no yelling, no screaming, no tomato throwing, especially if it doesn't go your way. And we just ask that those that are coming up to speak about the petition, please state your name, your address, your affiliation with the petition, and please send up your certificates of mailing. I'd like to introduce the board. To your far right is Miss Mary Young, Miss Annette Streets, Miss Mary Anderson, Janice Anderson, I'm sorry, Mr. Dave DeCilio, our recording clerk, Gail DeCilio, and to my right is our planning and zoning administrator, Mr. Jay Abansky, and I see someone hiding out there. Our town attorney is the inimitable Mark Florek. Mr. DeCilio, would you please give us the pleasure of reading the first continued item?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item number 1, 225 Lordship Boulevard. Petition of 225 Lordship Boulevard, LLC, seeking a site plan review and variances of minimum parking requirements, wall sign location, more than one freestanding sign, maximum allowable height for a freestanding sign, maximum allowable signage for a freestanding sign, and the setback for a freestanding sign to construct a drive-through restaurant and retail store in a CA zone. Hardship is stated as proposed mixed-use development incompatible with zoning regulations.
Thank you. Good evening, sir.
Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Raymond Rizzio, and I'm representing 225 Lordship Boulevard, LLC, with regard to this continued matter. One of the things I wanted to make clear is really we're here tonight for only two variances. I don't know if you remember from last hearing, we drew all the sign variances except for the rear fascia, the signage on the rear fascia of the building, and the parking variance. And we had revised our application so that we have, and modified our plan a little bit so that we have actually, rather than having a variance, I think Commissioner Young was talking about the confusion of getting the waiver of the shared parking requirements of 30% or going down to 17%. What we've done is just requested of you a very straightforward variance, meaning that we are required to have 218 spaces. We would just like a variance of 100 down to 181, and then I can explain to you why. So we, rather than go through like you did do a little bit of analysis about the town under its master plan kind of thinks in mixed-use projects, if they're big enough, they should be eligible to get a shared use reduction. Our traffic expert here is Mike Galante here, can also take you through specific questions. And I just want to make sure, I know we've handed in Michael's traffic report, and I just didn't want to, if the commissioners don't have it, I brought copies for you. So it should be dated January 29, 2019. Okay, great. So let me get started. I'm trying to keep this pretty simple and to the point. So we've met with staff. There was confusion over the number of spaces that were really totally needed here, how many had been adjusted. We have been through our approval process through the, hold on one second. We've been through our approval process through the P&Z to get the self-storage facility and the apartments, with the understanding always that we were going to come back for the buildings in the front, which will be a retail building. To explain, I'll give a little parking sheet for you, which will hopefully make this a little bit easier, and I think pretty straightforward. You'll see why. And then if you hear some little bit of testimony from Michael, you'll see it's very justified. This variance from 218 down to 181, we believe is justified. It's 37 space reduction. And one of the things I wanted to point out for you is we also, because the commission seemed to be a little concerned over the number of spaces we had. So we made some, this is the original plan. The original plan had the building close to the street. It had full circulation here, so the residential and the commercial kind of integrated, but the parking wasn't as clearly designated. And what we did was we reduced our self-storage building. So the plan that you have in front of you tonight, so that plan only had 163 spaces. We found 18 more spaces by basically pulling the building back so that the front elevation of the building will have parking in front for the retail building. That allowed us to put this courtyard between the commercial and the residential. It could still circulate the building. And then what we did was we shrunk the self-storage facility and managed to add 2 rows of spaces here. So we managed to find 18 additional spaces. And what made this also better, this is going to be the main entrance for the residential. So all the residential parking will not have to conflict with any of the commercial uses, though the vision will be there. I know if you've driven down Lordship Boulevard, there's been a tremendous change in the property and the upgrading of the property. So, quick, one of the issues with regard to one of the variances, the only sign variance left was, this is now a signage that would be considered our rear. And we really don't have a rear. Our hardship is that we're on a corner. We really have a couple sides, and we want to get a variance so that we can just hang with no variance as to size, a sonic sign on what really is the entrance to the building, but for zoning purposes, the rear elevation. So that's, we believe the uniqueness of that would warrant the hardship. What we really get to is the parking. So I gave you this chart. The chart shows that pursuant to our approval, we only needed 110 spaces, from zoning, we only needed 110 spaces for the residential component. The P&Z gave us a slight reduction of about 10 spaces because mostly all of our units are 1-bedrooms and studios. Then for the warehouse, we need 24 spaces. For the retail, we need 37 spaces. And for the drive-through, we need 47 spaces for a total of 218 spaces. We've gone through that with staff and parking people, engineering people, and we've all know that we can now come here with a very assuredly say we need 218 spaces pursuant to your regs and our approvals. As we said before, if you have over 200 spaces, you're entitled to a shared parking arrangement in a mixed-use scenario. This is and the reason I bring that up is because you've heard of compatible alternate uses, you've heard of mixed-use scenarios where you don't need additional parking. All the towns are getting away from these large parking fields and trying to get, especially when you have compatible uses, nobody wants to just look at empty spaces. So what we've done is requested a variance of 37 spaces, which is resulting in about a 17% reduction from what would be required pursuant to your regulations and approvals. And I'll take you through, and Mr. Galante will give you a detailed analysis as to peak times and what's needed and show you, pursuant to his findings and analysis, that 181 more than satisfies at all these uses basically at any time. So our current proposal shows this 17%. The previous one that we showed you before was 55 spaces. That was before was a reduction. That was before we made these modifications that are before you tonight, before we found the other 18 spaces. So the earlier version of the plan was a 25% reduction. We're only seeking a 17% reduction. What I tried to show you is in larger projects, if somebody applied the shared parking analysis, which you can get through the P&Z, we can't apply for it because we don't have the 200 spaces. Basically, with a 30% reduction, if you were required to have 300 spaces, and it was a mixed-use project, you could go down to 210. If it was a total parking required on site was 258, you could go down to the 181 that we're providing if you could use the shared parking. And then what I tried to show you was if you had 218 spaces and you used the 30%, you would only need 153 spaces. All in all, as I'm trying to show that the theory being when you have a larger mixed-use product, a reduction is warranted. Unfortunately, because we fall just short of the 200 spaces, we're not eligible for it. But the theory and the system is the same. The other interesting thing is, included in our 181 spaces is not included 9 cars in the queue for the fast food. And what's interesting, when you do your analysis for parking in a fast food drive-through restaurant, you don't take the patron area, you take the size of the total building. It's 1 space per 60 square feet. We only have 36 seats max in our building. 3/4 of the building is either prep area, cooking area, or distribution area. And we have 47 spaces calculated for under the regs. Mr. Galante and I talked about this before, and it said even the state hasn't come to grips with that 70%, and our operator from Sonic is here tonight, 70% of the business of these types of restaurants that have a drive-through comes through the drive-through. And now with Uber Eats, you even end up with 10% of the business is Uber Eats. So the guy who used to drive didn't want to go through the drive-through or didn't want to go to McDonald's, can just call Uber and have it delivered to his house. So he can get his Sonic, his Burger King, his whatever he wants delivered to his home. So you have this little, maybe 900 square feet of space, 900 to 1,000 square feet of space of sitting area that requires 47 spaces. We think the regulation is not consistent with the type of uses when it comes through drive-through, when you have drive-through businesses that have as much as 70% of their business through the drive-through. And what's amazing about Sonic, what's amazing about some of the other places, they have developed this into a science. You get, from the time you order to the time you've gotten your food, you're out of there in less than 3 minutes. The other thing that's interesting, what Sonic does that no one else does, they have what's called an expediting window. So say you get in line and you want a milkshake, and that's all you really want is a milkshake, or you want fries. They will trigger they have a separate door, which I can show you right here, where basically, so you come in, you go through, you make your order, and there's a little door right here, I can show you the floor plan, where a server will come out, give you a milkshake, you can leave the queue, go to the pass-through, and go. They come out, they make your change, give your thing, and go. So for that, you could be in and out of there in a minute. So it's a really, the whole key for these type of establishments is the speed with which you can move. What I'd like to do is have Mr. Galante take you through a quick analysis to show you why we believe 181 is the right number, make you comfortable with the fact that this variance is warranted. I think you see the mixed-use component of it. We have the residential. That's not going away. The compatible times, the self-storage, although you have 24, I don't think you'll ever have 24 spaces. You have 1 or 2 employees and 1 or 2 people at a time come to see their self-storage. Nobody just comes to look at their stuff in the cage and make sure it's still there. Basically, people come in, they move it out. Occasionally, they'll go grab something, and the length of stay on a lot of these is 9 months to a year and a half where people have their stuff parked in one of the cages. So, especially given this mixed use, meaning the self-storage, where you have 24 spaces and you're clearly not going to need them, where you have a high parking requirement for fast food, and that doesn't take into account cars in queue, doesn't take into account the small space, or that 70% of the business will go through the drive-through. That, the self-storage of residential, are all, we believe, they have higher requirements in the regs than they do in their actual use. Mr. Galante has reviewed all that and is going to make a quick presentation to you, and then we can open it up for questions. But other than that small requested variance, because we don't have a rear elevation to allow us to put one little sign up that's compliant, that our whole discussion tonight really is parking. And we just want to make you comfortable. And Mike, if you can take the commission through your analysis, and then we can go through any specific questions commissioners have.
Thank you. Good evening. Mike Galante, Frederick Clark Associates. I'm not going to repeat what Mr. Rizzo just went through. I'm going to get to this chart, which is in the report that's dated January 29th. And there are 3 charts that look just like this, and I'll touch on them in general, but the format's the same. What we did is what we call, as traffic engineers, a shared parking analysis. Very simple. In this case, where we have multiple and different types of land uses on the subject property, there's quite frankly a benefit to having different uses with different needs for parking, and the same thing for traffic as far as impacts to area roads. Tonight we're just focusing on parking itself. This chart just simply goes through the process of how many spaces are required by the town and how many spaces we believe are needed based on actual studies prepared by traffic engineers pretty much across the country for different types of land uses. And it's from documents that are provided for different land uses. What was mentioned about fast food, you know, do we really need so many parking spaces for a fast food restaurant with a drive-through window? ITE and even State of Connecticut DOT, which we follow the standards that they look for. We use this format in pretty much every town in Connecticut. We don't work for every town, but we work in many towns. But we don't take any credit for the fast food restaurant that the person doesn't need a parking space. So I would say these numbers are conservative, and just keep that in mind. The site itself is proposed to have 181 parking spaces across all land uses. Shared parking, other than the self-storage, people can use different parking spaces on the site itself. This chart just simply goes through that process, and what we find, and if you look at the bottom corner on any one of the charts, and it's called P-1, P for parking, of course. 1 is the weekday, 2 is the weekday evening, and P-3 is a Saturday. They have different requirements, different needs, different types of patterns, so that's why we have 3 different time periods. What we found is that the weekday is really 1 p.m., essentially lunchtime, and that's the peak parking demand. We also find that November is probably the busiest month, other than maybe the week or 2 before Christmas, but it's a busy, typical month throughout the year. For example, we wouldn't do a study in July or August because people are theoretically away on vacation, so we don't do that. So we need 158 spaces on a week for a weekday condition after you apply credits for the different types of uses. And when I say credits, one is what we call an internal capture. I live in the residential, I walk down and buy a hamburger, or I live in the residential and I walk down to the store itself. Not so often, you know, you wouldn't take credit for going to the self-storage facility. We don't take that credit. So there's a combination of from traffic and parking. So that's why the number of parking spaces needed in this case for during the day at 1 o'clock, essentially lunchtime, is 158 spaces. We propose 181 spaces. The weekday evening is something higher. You need 177 spaces. That occurs at 7 p.m. at night. And then on a Saturday, again at 7 p.m. at night, we're assuming all the stores are open. Obviously the residential is 24 hours a day. We would need 171 spaces. When I say conservative, and I make that point because yes, these numbers are close to 181 spaces that we're providing, but we're not taking any credit for the fast food where, as mentioned a couple times tonight, 70% of those customers are not parking at all. So I think it's safe to say, and my point is that I believe the number of 181 spaces for this type of mixed-use development is appropriate. And just to touch on the credits we take, and then I'll stop and answer any questions you may have. One credit is transit. We're allowed to use 10% is using some type of bus or some type of service to get to the site itself. In reality, it might be higher. It depends on the location. This location, I believe 10% is appropriate. The other 10% credit we take is for the internal capture that I was referring to. I live here, I shop here, or I buy a hamburger here at dinner time or lunchtime. And we try to look at those critical, in this case, the critical times are dinner, essentially, and lunch. And that's what the charts say, and I'm trying to keep it very, very simple as far as the parking need, and it's called a shared parking analysis that we prepared. And I can certainly answer questions. I tried to keep it, because it gets confusing with all the numbers.
Sure. Does the board have any questions for Mr. Galante or Attorney Rizzio? Ms. Young?
How are you?
Picking up on the last thing I heard you say, get into the routine, thank you, good evening.
Oh.
Picking up on the last thing I heard you say, you took a 10% credit for transit.
Yes.
So what is that 10% equal to in terms of number of spaces?
Oh, it's only a couple spaces, actually. I don't have an exact number, but I can figure it out for you, because it'd be different for each time period. But it's this column right here.
And thank you. Did I hear you say that at the peak period, you still would not need 181, although that's what you're providing?
The proposal is 181 spaces, and the maximum spaces needed would be in the weekday evening at 177 spaces.
Okay.
But just keep in mind, we're not taking any credit for the fast food. I think in reality we'll lower that need, that number of 177.
And even if I built back in the 10% credit, which we haven't defined that number, I still may not exceed the 181 provided?
You definitely don't exceed it during the day or on Saturday. You may touch close to it on a weekday evening at 7 p.m.
And shared parking, as I'm familiar with it, suggests that there's a point in time where not everything is operating simultaneously.
Correct.
Did you or Attorney Rizzio describe when one or more uses will not be in operation?
We're assuming everything is open. For example, the store, whatever it might be, we're assuming it's open at 7 o'clock at night. It may not be. For example, on a Saturday night, it may not be open at 7 o'clock. It may close at 6 o'clock. But it could be anyone that's going in there, so we don't apply that credit. So it could be a different tenant 2 years from now.
When Mr. Attorney Rizzio gets to the microphone, I think he wants to tell me something.
Yeah, I think what you're, I don't know if you're also getting at the compatibility at the end.
I am, thank you.
Not, so, for example, the apartments, although you have to have 110 spaces for the apartments, basically from midnight to 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, those spaces have their highest demand. Most through the day, I can guarantee you don't even have 50% of the spaces are occupied. And then again, starting from 5, typically, depending on where you're coming from, if anybody's coming from Stratford, it may be starting at 8, but typically from 5, your demand starts to rise within the within the residential parking component. With regard to the self-storage, I don't know if there's ever a peak. I think you assign 24 spaces. If you ever use 4 or 5, that would be the ultimate peak, but that's not what the regs say. I mean, I have clients that run self-storage facilities. If they have 2 or 3 people ever at a time, there's typically, they're of such low intensity of use, they only have 1 employee on site typically. Then you have the retail not going to be busy before 9 o'clock. Typically hours are 9, and then they slow down. They're busy throughout the day, and then slow down dinner and after. So you have a true compatibility of uses here. In the big one, the 2 big ones, you have one that has no demand at all, which is the biggest building there with regard to parking. And then the smallest one has probably the highest percentage calculation, but because the state and transit won't let you take into account the credits you really should have, meaning that 70% comes through the drive-through, 10% comes through Uber Eats, and that you only have 36 spaces. So what's interesting with 36 seats, what's interesting about the regulations is that they don't measure parking based on patron area. They measure it based on the size of the building. And when you look at, where's our floor plan? We're parking for 2,700 square feet of use. Our seating area is basically, here, and that's it. So, and we have 47 seats that we get taxed for that, not taxed, let's say, assessed for that as a requirement when we only have 36 seats and we don't get credit for the 9 spaces we also have in the queue. For all those reasons, these compatible uses, because they're not busy at the same time, we believe justify the reduction in the parking. And because we don't have 200 spaces, we can't even ask, we need to come to you for relief versus the P&Z. The interesting thing is, if the buildings were smaller and more intense, we could have more parking requirements to get us to the 200 and then ask for a bigger reduction. So we really think this is an excellent way to use this building. We think it's a good way to see that you don't have parking farms and a lot of blacktop exposed. We believe we have completely turned around this property so that it's an attractive amenity to the town versus something that was the less desirable use over the last 20 years there down on Lordship Boulevard. And then from a neighbor standpoint, we're surrounded by oil tanks and the town transfer station. So this is a really good use for this facility that really has no neighbors to impact. We believe we have plenty of parking for the uses. We think the uniqueness of our uses and the compatibility of our uses warrants enough, and the way that the regulations assess the fast food component and actually the drive-through, I mean the self-storage, that would warrant a hardship, which we would hopefully request this commission would acknowledge and grant us a variance to allow our parking to be reduced from 218 spaces to 181 spaces. It's a long way answering your question. I apologize, but I was trying to sum it all up for you.
So I heard Mr. Galante talk about, a retailer, a restaurant. The plans say Sonic, so I'm assuming we're talking about Sonic Restaurant.
Correct.
Open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Correct.
And I thought I saw on one of the elevation drawings, or maybe it was discussed, at Family Dollar being the retail store.
There's no lease sign. That is, they would like to come to that location.
And if they did, would you have any knowledge of what their hours of operation are?
I think the hours, I've done a few stores, they vary from time, like if it's New York City, they're open all hours. But most of the stores that I've seen have been open, I believe, from like 8 to 9, something like that.
Is it fair to say that, excuse me, Mr. Galante's analysis envisions these retail and restaurant stores to be open potentially 24/7?
I don't, no. And I don't think what's that? What's Mike?
If we assume the 24-hour operation for a variety store or whatever, you would actually lower the numbers because your traffic, your customer base gets spread out. So we're assuming that I think they call it a 16-hour day actually, or a 12-hour day.
So did I hear you just describe that 24 hours actually generates a lower parking projection versus
I was really
16
thinking
hours?
of traffic, but it just spreads out the impact. So the parking demand or the traffic volume is spread out over a longer period of time.
And just
So we don't take that, we don't assume that.
And the Sonic is open basically, is it what, from 8 in the morning till 10 a.m. at night for seating, and then it goes to midnight for the drive-through. Most of the drive-through facilities, you'll see a lot of the restaurants that even are 24 hours, they shut down the seating after 10 o'clock, and your only ability to get the food would be through a drive-through. What they don't want to do is people just hanging there for the night. If you want the food, you want to get it, you're going to go. But they're not looking to set up housing for people within the restaurant.
I heard you also describe 18 spaces found since we last
Yes.
saw you. Could you put up the site plan again and
Sure.
tell me about, did we lose landscaping, or was it really
No.
just a shifting of the building
Shifting
and
of the building,
relocating of
yeah.
what was going to be parking spaces?
So these are new spaces, so the building will either hang over or the building the first floor can be revised so that these spaces were established. If you look at the old plan, so they'll shorten these storage spaces to allow these to be parking spaces on the first floor, okay? Then, what they did was shift so that rather than having this here, they put the courtyard here. And where we previously did not have any parallel parking here, we have a row of parallel parking. You don't see them here. Wait, a row of parallel parking here. So the parallel parking, so if somebody comes in and they want to go, they basically, this will all be residential parking now. It will not really be gated, it won't be gated off for the self-storage. And people for the self-storage will either pull in here and go through the entrance, or they can have parallel parking and get closer to their stuff. So there's more than enough parking, certainly for the self-storage. We also thought it was important, by pulling the building back, we lose any kind of conflict with people having to come in. In other words, when you come in, you're not going to be, it will tend to keep the retail people parking in front of the front door, right in front of their building, and not conflict with the other traffic. So what we did really was, by redesigning this, adding the additional spaces, we were allowed to segregate the traffic flow much better.
Going back to the 181 provided, greater than any number Mr. Galante came up with that he perceives you actually need, these long rows of parking spaces, is there any breakout within them for a tree occasionally?
Well, we have a landscaping plan, which is, we don't have a detailed landscaping plan, but we will, through the P&Z, we'll have to submit a detailed landscaping plan. You gotta remember, in the back here, we have huge white pine, I mean, they're 20-foot white pines there that we planted a whole big buffer area to protect us from the transfer station. On the side, the parking that was added, these 10 spaces, were all interior. So they're against the building. So you wouldn't really put a tree there. And we have a lot of landscaping between us and where the tank farm is.
So I'm not as concerned about landscaping for purposes of screening to the adjoining properties, but rather providing shade to the people parking in your parking lot. And if we were to approve your design with 181, that would perhaps stifle the enthusiasm of the planning and zoning boards to take out spaces and insert trees in lieu of them. So I'm wondering now, while we have the flexibility to decide, is 181 the right number, or could we afford to go lower because of Mr. Galante's numbers? Is there an opportunity to put a tree in some of these longer rows of parking spaces?
Well, I think one of the things you can do, and I don't know, a lot of towns have, is you have the ability to put, the trees, like at the bumper trees, you know what I mean, where you have a jut out, and then you have I don't know the answer to that question. If the commission would allow us to go down to 177 spaces, we would have no objection to that.
I would only want to trade that if I was getting something for the trade, if I was getting a commitment to a certain number of trees equivalent to the spaces we would be relieving you from, which is why I'm asking if perhaps Michael Galante or somebody has looked to see if he could afford how much space you would need for a tree and what that would equal in spaces lost for him.
See, what we've done really is by segregating these spaces, we have our landscaped areas, we have a landscape plan in the front, and from the streets areas, there's really not these big long rows of parking. Because you have the 4 buildings, it's not like if you go to a mall and you have this big store and then just parking forever. We have 4 component use areas that have relatively, non-intrusive, I think, parking, that you don't have parking fields with this mixed use, and that's what I think is the advantage that we have.
How many spaces are in that row on the top of your plan, if you will? On the,
Here?
right,
Yeah,
correct.
22.
So that to me is a long row, maybe not long to you. It appears from where I'm sitting to be a long row where, again, for purposes of providing shade to the motorists who are parking there, might benefit.
I would agree if you did, but if you think about where that is on the side of a 100,000 square foot storage building between a tank farm and then out the back. You know what I mean? It's
Are
not.
they not getting sun there? Is that your point? Are they not getting sunlight there? Is that your point?
Not much, I can tell you that. They're going to be there's going to be a heavy buffer here, extremely heavy buffer here, in a building that sits east to west, so the run rises west and the west. I mean, you maybe you'll catch some light, but I don't think you're going to catch a ton of it. This is, this building's what, 40 feet high?
If I could ask Mr. Urbanski a question. Mr. Urbanski, does the Stratford zoning regulations have a requirement of X number of trees per row of parking spaces?
They do, but that's only for when new parking lots are being created.
That's not what we're calling this? And what is the standard if this were new?
It's, I have to check, I believe it's one shade tree of 6-inch caliper for every 15 or 20 spaces. I have to double check that number though.
So in this arena, when people are asking us for relief, we can respond in kind by saying we want something as well. We have the authority, I believe, subject to your confirming, to require trees, even though the zoning regs don't require it, assuming the applicant's agreeable.
Absolutely.
We would agree if the commission wanted to allow us to go down to 177 and replace four of the spaces with a landscaped area within any row that exceeds more than 15 cars, something like that.
I'm one member. I like the sound of that, but we'll see how others feel. One more question.
Sure.
I heard you, I believe, say, beyond what's on the materials given to us, that one of the hardships you're citing for the signage, is the corner lot, your status as a corner lot?
Status of the corner lot, and then the type of use which needs circulation around the building, so that we don't really, the entrance to our building is actually the rear of the building for zoning purposes. And that given the unique use and the corner location, we don't really have a rear elevation. Actually, the most rear elevation would be deemed our side elevation, which would be the elevation that would be like right here. That's probably the one area where people don't enter or go or drive by.
And do we
And
have,
that's a side.
could we put up the drawing that shows that sign that you're seeking relief for?
Yes, we have that. No, it's not that. We got stoppers for our easel so it doesn't slide on me anymore.
Nice.
Now you like that? We upgraded. Okay, so,
Commissioner Young, just before we move on, I have an answer to your question. It's one shade tree for every 10 parking spaces, 3 inches in caliper for any new parking lot.
Thank you.
so that would be, this is the north. So it'd be this elevation here, which would be, or it'd be this sign.
And the variance you're seeking is not about the location on the building or the size, but rather it's the second sign? Because you're asking for more than one, or?
No, it's just being able to you can't put any sign, no matter how big, on the rear of a building in Stratford.
And you are, because of the fact that you're on a corner lot.
Correct.
Is that sign illuminated? Am I getting kept up at night if I'm in one of the dwelling units looking at your sign, like some Seinfeld episode?
I got it, I don't.
Are you offering a condition that you will turn it off at 10 o'clock?
Yeah, no, how about, what we would agree to do is, and remember, it would only be that one sign anyway. It's only the rear, that rear elevation sign.
The signs are not that powerful. They're two LED 4-foot bulbs. They're just enough to illuminate those.
So you can get back to me if you're not sure if it's a yes or a no, or,
Yeah, we would prefer not to require that it be turned off. I think if you also, the residential building is probably, I mean, this is not gonna hold, a little sign here, this building's 5 stories high, 5 to 6 stories high. The sign is maybe a 24 by 36 sign, and it would be across a parking, across a driveway area to, I don't see that in any way, shape, or form that is gonna keep anybody up.
size is in the eye of the beholder, perhaps.
Right. I think distance is important, though. And in this instance, the distance is gonna be probably 50, at least 24, about 75 feet from the sign.
Thank you for answering all my questions. I'll let others speak. Thank you.
Attorney Rizzio, is there a device, is there a sensor that at a certain time of the evening that it would automatically dim the light? I mean, dim the sign?
All the lights have have cutoffs, so they can't shine off the property. So they all have they're, what do they call, dark sky compliant. So, which means that you can't have the light shooting up. The balance of the signs, I mean, it's really minimal sign on a very small building. It's a 2,700 square foot building versus about a 60,000 square foot building here and a 100,000 square foot building here. I just really don't see that the light coming off that rear, we'll call it the rear fascia, being an issue. And it's also going to be compliant. We're not asking for any size variances as to the sign. So the sign itself is, where's that sign? No, the sign on the rear fascia here we're talking about is maybe only 22 square feet in size, so it's small.
Paul, I'm
So-
sorry, I have one more question when
Yes.
you're ready.
Please, Ms. Young?
Mr. Urbanski, could you or Attorney Rizzio just acquaint us with what happened in the half an hour between Brian Lampart saying he was unhappy versus now he's happy half an hour later in this email I got?
We had a conversation and discussed, Chris Russo in my office spoke with him. Go ahead, Chris.
Sir, please just mention your name and your address, please, for the record.
Chris Russo with Russo and Rizzio LLC, office at 1 Post Road in Fairfield.
Thank you.
I talked with Fire Marshal Lampart, and there was some question where when the apartment building was redone, there was a question as to where the sprinkler connection was when they redid it, because they redid the entire sprinkler connection. So he thought that it was up here. But we had somebody go out, our surveyor went out, and it's actually located over here, which if you look at the new plan,
He actually has better access to his
so
sprinkler.
he has better access. He thought on this new revised plan that he was gonna have to have his apparatus hook up to sprinklers right here, and he was gonna have trouble with this landscape court here, but they actually, when they redid the system and he looked at it, they're over here. So the fire trucks would go over here and back up and hook up right here.
Attorney Rizzo, on the Lordship Boulevard side of the Family Dollar, where the parking spaces are there,
Yes.
is there any way you can put up any kind of hedges or trees there, because it's against those cars along the street?
Yes, there will
Is
be.
that considered?
There's a landscape plan that we have that will basically be all hedges and low-lying trees that'll be, at least as high as the lights of a car along the whole Lordship Boulevard. Yeah, and then there's shade trees there also.
Thank you. To answer your question, Ms. Young, about the hours of operation from the Family Dollar, we just Googled, it's between 7 a.m., 8 a.m., they close at 10 p.m. So if that answers your question. Are there any other board members that have any questions? Ms. Streets?
Good evening. I just want to ask a couple of questions about the self-storage facility.
Sure.
What are the sizes of the units, the storage units?
Well, they run from, not the size of, but maybe 500 square feet to 40 square feet. There's multiple different sizes. They also will have garages, like if you wanted to store an antique car in there, you'll be able to store an antique car. So it's a mixed bag, from enough for one apartment to one for one house, and you could also take multiple, if you wanted to, you could take multiple storage components.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real mixed bag, because it's the flexibility of what people need. Who are the people that go there? People between houses. They don't want to pay, or can't take a Myers moving truck and just hold on to the facility, hold on to the cab, the trailer for a year while they're between houses, or people in apartments. So you have literally 8 by 10 units, and then you have, a couple hundred square foot units. So
Well,
it's
You mentioned the moving trucks, and
Yes.
that's what I'm really kind of concerned about.
everything will be inside. There'll be
No, it's not so much the inside, it's the vehicles getting in
Yes,
and being able to load and unload.
correct.
Could you just show me how they would
How
come
this
in? Because
circulates?
you showed the parallel parking for cars, I'm
In fact,
assuming.
we had one that showed actually that they have all the turning radiuses. So basically, there's a whole loading area here, a truck could come in, circulate, and then pack here, or they could come in, back up and load. The nice thing about this, by having the self-storage facility back here, those trucks don't interfere with anything.
Okay, that's my concern.
Yes,
Will
no.
they- All right, okay, thank you.
And then we also had to show turning radiuses for the trucks up front, so
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Ms. Anderson?
Thank you. I had one question, but I also wanted to make a comment for the record that I did watch the video. I wasn't here at the January meeting, but I actually watched it twice.
I got to confuse you a couple times.
For the self-storage, is it all accessed through one entry, or are those the self-storage where
Well,
you can enter
Yes,
on the outside along?
basically you have load and you unload and then you bring in, and then they have all hallways. So these are they're like mini apartments. They're apartments for stuff.
Right, but it's all self-enclosed. There aren't
Correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
external.
No, only in the rear, they are talking about possibly having some garage units where you'd be able to store a car, but it's a unit.
Right, no,
Right.
yeah.
But other
okay.
than that, especially as you get up, remember, through 3 to 4 floors.
Right.
So it's basically an apartment building for staff.
Yep, thank you.
Any other board members with questions? Ms. Young?
Just to make sure I'm following what we heard at the last meeting and this evening and the materials we've gotten from both you and Jay Hibansky, returning to Jay's December 20th memorandum, where he advises us what your application is, he talks about our need to be concerned about the signage facing the apartments. We might want to have them be substantially dimmed during the evening hours to reduce negative impacts to quality of life. I heard you, I believe earlier, say likely at 10 o'clock we will limit this restaurant to a drive-through. So I'm thinking, if I'm already there and driving through, do I really need your signage to tell me I've arrived?
We would agree, I would believe, after 10 o'clock to have that rear fascia light to be dimmed by, say, 50% or whatever. We're comfortable with that. We're not, I was just trying to explain, I don't think it's gonna have any impact, but I'm not voting. So if it makes you comfortable for us to reduce, to dim that rear elevation light that faces the apartments after 10 o'clock, we would agree to that.
I heard you say to 50% of whatever is.
Yeah.
And then in that same memorandum, Mr. Urbanski cites the hardship you offered initially and identifies does not appear to meet the hardship requirements listed in 8-6 of the Connecticut General Statutes. So can you?
Well, I'd feel pretty comfortable defending this in any. I don't think we're going to have any appeals. We really don't have any neighbors. The one person I represent, the client, the neighbor across the street for the owns Regional Networks of Program Building, and he fully supports the application. So I'm not anticipating any appeals, but I believe the uniqueness of our use, I think the interpretation of the strict enforcement of these regulations doesn't take into account the uses, meaning the drive-through being overly assessed for parking based on its use. I think that the fact that we have a multi-use property in it, and I think it's a hardship that because we haven't developed it to its maximum, that we can't take advantage of the reduction. In other words, you know what it contradicts itself that if we had more intense use, because we certainly have the room for it, and required more parking spaces, we could ask for an even greater reduction than we're asking for without coming for a variance. So we believe strict enforcement of this regulation as applied to a smaller use like ours, and to say that we're different from the general, I don't know of any other project I've been involved with that has had these 4 uses, so it is unique to this property that we have. This is probably one of the most unique properties I've had, that's surrounded by a tank farm, a transfer station, so that we really needed to build a self-storage facility to buffer the rest of the project and Lordship Boulevard from the transfer station. So this is about a unique property as it is, and I think it's also unique enough that it doesn't apply to the general scope of development in Stratford. So I think for all those reasons, this property has unique aspects, and then given the fact that our building requires full circulation with regard to the sign, or use requires full circulation with regard to the sign, and that we're on a corner lot, that puts us in a unique position of not really having a rear fascia. So for that reason, I believe strict enforcement of that regulation would require us to not have a sign on the entrance of our building. So, which is also extremely unique. So for all those reasons, we believe we would satisfy any legal contest, and I believe hopefully tonight, as I put that into the record, have established a hardship that you folks would be comfortable with.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does the board have any other questions? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, folks. I really appreciate your time and patience.
Is there anyone here in attendance that would like to speak in favor of this petition? Seeing none, is there anyone in attendance that would like to speak in opposition to this petition? Seeing none, do we have a motion to close? Motion to close by Mr. DeSulio, second by Ms. Young. All in favor? None opposed? Ms. Anderson, will you please read our second and last item on the agenda, please?
96 Bronson Road, petition of Mark Lottner seeking waivers of section 3.11 to construct a 2-car garage and the front setback incidental to a single-family dwelling in an RS-3 zone. Hardship is the topography is very steep. And I'd like to note for the chair that I was a customer at one point of Mr. Glockner's, so I wanted that to be noted, although I don't see that as a problem here, but I wanted it noted for the record. Thank you.
It's noted. Thank you. Good evening, sir. State your name, your address, and your affiliation to this petition, please. And if you have any certificates of mailing, you can send them out.
I'm already driving. dropped them off.
Oh, very good.
Mark Lochner, 476 Bridgeview Plate. What?
Can you speak a little louder, please? You can raise
Mark
it up.
Lochner, 476 Bridgeview Place, Stratford.
Speak your mind.
As you said, the hardship here is just the property is on a complete slope. It goes right straight down to the river. The only place that you could possibly put a garage is where I've offered to put one. That's pretty much it.
Does the board have any questions for Mr. Glockner? Mr. DiCilio?
Yeah, the first question I have is, I went down and looked at the site, and I noticed that you are at, according to my map, next door to the...
That's correct.
Are you speaking on behalf for the applicant, or do you own both properties?
I own both properties.
Okay,
I'm
got
sorry.
it. I was getting a little confused. Okay, thank you. And I did witness your topographical challenge on the site and your current parking pad, so that's it. Just was wondering about that.
Any other board members have any questions? Ms. Young?
Good evening. The board members received a memorandum from Jay Hibansky dated January 28th. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, no.
I'm happy to hand you mine in a moment. Mr. Hibansky suggests that if we were inclined to grant this variance, it be with the following conditions, and I'm going to read them out loud. The applicant shall immediately apply for a building permit to legalize all work done without a permit. The applicant shall obtain a letter or email from the town engineer stating that he is satisfied with the proposed work as approved. This letter shall be delivered to the Office of Planning and Zoning and kept in the application file. I may have read that too quickly, but if you got the gist of it, are those conditions acceptable to you if this were to be granted?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
You can keep this.
Yeah, I don't have any idea of any of this.
Mr. Glockner, just out of curiosity, did you try to, were there any other alternatives with getting that parking garage next to your house as an extension, as an attached garage? Have you ever had any contractors come and
I don't think there's a way to do it.
I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't think you could possibly do that with the way the property is.
Mm-hmm.
It literally drops off. I really don't think it's possible. If there were another way to have done this, I would have approached it, but there's just no other way.
Yeah, I did a site review. I was just curious, that's all.
Okay.
Any other board members have any questions? Ms. Streets?
Good evening. I'm just curious about why you proceeded to, do this project without getting permits first.
I wasn't aware I needed any.
Okay.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
Uh,
I didn't construct anything other than a wall.
Yeah, but permit was required. What would you do in case your petition is not approved?
For the garage,
Yes.
I wouldn't have one.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other board members have any questions? Thank you, Mr. Glockner. Is there anyone in attendance that would like to speak in favor of this petition? Seeing none, is there anyone here that would like to speak in opposition to this petition? Seeing none, do we have a motion to close? Motion to close by Ms. Anderson. Do we have a second? Second by Mr. DiCilio. All in favor? Well, that concludes our public session. Oh, do we have a motion to close the public session? Moved by Ms. Street, second. Ms. Anderson, all in favor? Anybody would like to take a break, or do you want to go right into the administrative session? Okay. Do we have a motion to take item number 1 off the table? Mr. Sealer, can you please speak a little louder?
I make a motion to take 225 Lordship Boulevard off the table.
Second by Ms. Young. Discussion? Ms. Young?
Am I still using the microphone when we are talking to each other? I guess so. Okay. So I am an advocate for granting the variance with a modification, as I was exploring with Attorney Rizzio, to reduce the 181 spaces provided down to 177 so that I could get back 4 trees consistent with what Jay Hibansky described we would have gotten had this been considered a new parking lot. Those 4 trees would be, I think he said, 3-inch caliber in size, and they would be placed wherever we have 10 or more spaces in a row. For me, parking lot design is not just about the spaces, it's about the landscaping that goes with it. I found Mr. Galanti's information compelling, telling me that, not his words but mine, under worst case scenario, they will need 177 spaces. So I believe they can afford to lose 4 more. They started out, not started out, but this evening they began by asking for a relief of 37 spaces. So we would end up, if you go down this path I'm on, with a relief of 41 spaces. For me, I'd rather see that landscaping and take the risk that they won't need that 4, because I do feel this will be a car-driven scenario. I don't know that the majority of people will be parking and staying in to utilize the restaurant. I think a lot of them will be coming and leaving and taking it with them. I also was grateful to hear that the applicant was willing to dim the lights to 50% at 10 o'clock when they don't perceive people will be entering the building. I think that, again, strikes a good balance for this mixed-use development to be sensitive to the apartment dwellers, as Jay Hibansky suggested we should be when he wrote his memorandum. I also think that this is a corner lot. We are talking about some public safety measures, and I think those would be the more traditional hardships that one could use to justify such action. And I'm willing to make all that a motion, but I'd like to see if anyone else has thoughts on what I just described.
Mr. DiCilio?
Thank you, Ms. Young. This application I'm very conflicted with, and I'll tell you why. Last year, this board granted a waiver to this applicant to build a 120,000 square foot building behind the apartments. And on that plan, this applicant showed 2 buildings, a 2,000 square foot restaurant and a 2,000 square foot bank. I don't know if any of the other commissioners remember the plans, but I remember them. They're still in my file drawer. The application before us is a 2,000 square foot drive-through, or 2,300, with an almost 10,000 square foot Family Dollar. The applicant has made an attempt to justify a hardship, but to me, regardless of even if I want this plan, this is a classic example of a self-created hardship. There's no doubt in my mind. Mr. Hibansky, I believe in his notes, concur with that. I think the applicant can build the Family Dollar and have all the parking he wants, or he can build the Sonic drive-through and build all the parking he wants. But he wants prime rib and lobster all in the same application. And for that reason and that reason alone, I oppose it. I mean, I have other concerns with that can be addressed by planning and zoning, such as the exit to the drive-through. There's no left turn lane exclusive, so I go to the dump all the time, the transfer station, and the traffic is barreling down there, and it's going to stack up, and people are going to be they're going to get their food, and they're not going to be able to move. I have a lot of different issues, but those are all secondary to the simple fact that I truly believe in my heart that there's no hardship here. I mean, it's a stretch to say, oh, the fact that our project isn't big enough to qualify for a reduction in parking is a hardship. It's not big enough. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, this applicant can go, if they're approved, great. If they're denied, they can go before to change the zoning regulations and change all the parking, and if they believe that's in their best interest. But I'm firmly in opposition to this application for those reasons. Very rarely do we disagree, Mary.
Any further insights from the board? Ms. Anderson?
I struggle with the hardship issue also because I think it is self-inflicted. I think it's packing so much into this space. And I do remember the discussion about a bank instead of a Family Dollar. So I'm inclined to not grant a hardship.
Well, being an old firefighter myself, I've been in many areas where you have a conglomeration of different entities together, and especially during peak hours. And it can be very difficult to get an apparatus in, especially when we have to get to the seat of the emergency. And although I like the fact that that blighted area is certainly being constructed for good use, it seems to be a little bit much. And that's my conflict with that. I mean, I would like to see it, but again, I have to step back and look at it from the view that there's going to be a lot of people in that area, let alone the units of the apartments as well as the facilities, the commercial uses. So I share in the conflict of that. Is there any other members that have anything else to say? Ms. Streets?
Consistent with my question about very large vehicles with the storage, self-storage facility, and just the general anticipated level of traffic and activity, I share the same concerns about just too much in such a small or limited area. And I think that there are some safety concerns about the traffic. And I also wonder about how it would impact anyone living there. It just seems a little too busy for what they would want. So, yeah, those are my concerns.
Any other input by the board? So do we have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to deny 255 Lordship Boulevard for lack of demonstrating a hardship.
Motion made by Mr. Sulio, second by Ms. Anderson. Roll call. Ms. Young, how do you see?
So if I'm not supporting the motion, then I'm saying no to the motion?
You're saying no? Yes, correct.
No?
Ms. Streets?
Yes.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Mr. DeSulio?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Application fails 4-1. Do you have a motion to take 96 Bronson Road off the table? So moved by Ms. Anderson, second by Ms. Young. Discussion? Mr. DeSulio?
Unlike the previous applicant, this applicant, if anyone had the opportunity to actually visit the site, has absolutely a physical hardship. The slope on the property that is shown on both the surveys that fronts the river is very severe. And also it's on a very unusual little, like kind of a Bronson Street, which I don't know why the town doesn't just give that land to the guy, because it's like sort of an extension of a street there. But anyway, it's an absolute clear hardship, and I am supportive of it, and I will make a motion to approve.
Any discussion? Ms. Young?
I gave away my comments to the applicant. Would Mr. DeCilio consider modifying his motion to include the conditions that Mr. Hibansky suggested that I read out loud during the course of the hearing? Ms. Streets has it in front of her, if you will. Again, that was that the applicant has agreed to immediately apply for a building permit to legalize all work done without a permit, that the applicant shall obtain a letter or an email from the town engineer stating he is satisfied with the proposed work as approved, and that letter will be delivered to the Office of Planning and Zoning, kept in the application file.
So moved that I agree to amend my motion to include those two conditions.
And did you cite the hardship, the topography?
The hardship is the physical topography of the site.
I second your motion.
Motion seconded by Ms. Young, made by Mr. DeSulio. Any other discussion? So we're going to vote in favor of this application.
That is the motion.
We'll make a roll call. Ms. Young,
Yes?
voting for yes, we're in favor. Ms. Streets?
Yes?
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Mr. DeSulio?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Passes unanimously. Congratulations. Usually we say restraining all kinds of emotion, but we'll let this one go since there's one person. Okay, do we have a motion to approve the minutes from last session?
Motion to approve?
Motion to approve by Ms. Young, second by Ms. Anderson. All in favor?
Aye.
None opposed? We don't have a plan review, huh? I'm sorry, I got it discombobulated here. Oh, there's no campsite plan review. Any concerns from the members? Anything anybody wants to discuss? Any pressing issues? None? Mr.
was-
Urbanski?
Yeah, I was supposed to follow up with Commissioner Young regarding a procedure for submitting revised materials 10 days in advance of a public hearing so that those items go out in a mailer. You know, obviously, we can't require it, but I think it was something that the board was interested in doing. That one kind of fell off my radar. I've got a note here, so I plan on following up with Commissioner Young this week.
Any other concerns from the members? Ms. Young?
Jade reminded me of something. Forgive me if we already got this and I have forgotten, but was Attorney Floric generating a memorandum about ADA being a hardship that we can recognize going forward when someone mentions that?
I'll follow up with the attorney to make, I'm not sure you have anything prepared for tonight, correct? No. Yeah. I can follow up with Attorney Floric.
I didn't know he was still in the room. Thank you.
I had a feeling you might need me. Yeah, just, Jay will send me an email and I'll have it for your next meeting.
I'll go back and get the exact question and we'll
Yeah.
go over it this week.
Or you can call me, whatever you like.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Any other concerns or comments from the board? With that, do we have a motion to adjourn? So moved by Mr. DeSulio, second by Ms. Streets. All in favor?
Aye.
None opposed. Good night, everybody. Thank you.